Hi there, I'm Erica with A Needle and Thread in Spring, Texas, and this is the third video in my series. We're working through this Block of the Month quilt, the Lucky Stars Block of the Month. I'm gonna be honest with you, the colors in this quilt, on this paper, on the pattern, not very pretty, but the fabrics that I'm using are Riley Blake fabrics. They are from the line called Granny Chic, designed by Lori Holt. So you know that the colors in this line of fabric are lots of fun. You can see some of the blocks behind me, the teals, the pinks, the yellows. It's really, really pretty. So I hope you guys will come back, subscribe, so that you can get some tips and pointers on how to really make your blocks accurate, get some good sewing tips from me, and improve your quilting, because honestly that's what I'm here for, to help you improve your quilting. So the third block that we're going to do, you can see it across the top up here. It's in teal, pink, and white. This is what it looks like right down here. You know, some people label it the Balkan puzzle. That's one of the names for it, but it's really an easy block to make. The pattern itself gives you instructions on how to make 3 of the blocks at one time. In our previous videos, we've talked about making half square triangles, 2 at a time, half square triangles. We talked about chain sewing to economize your sewing time so things go by really, really quickly. We're not going to do any chain sewing today. To just get the content to you in a quick, succinct kind of a way, I'm only going to do 1 block today, but your instructions give you cutting instructions for 3 blocks. Just like the other weeks also, there's a secondary block that you get instructions for making. Now, I have not been making those blocks because they are smaller blocks, which is great because it amps up the difficulty a little bit, but the techniques that you're using to make this block here is usually the same technique that you're using to make the secondary block. The secondary block today is a shoe fly block, which looks like this, and it is a smaller block. You get instructions on how to make 2 of them. Excuse me, haha. You get instructions on how to make 5 of them. So cutting and making for 5 shoe fly blocks come with this week's this block instruction, but we're not going to do this. These half square triangle blocks that it wants you to make, you learned how to make them in a previous video, so I'm not going to go over that. It's also put together in a 9 patch. We went over that in a previous video. I'm not going to go over that. What we are going to do though today is this one down here, which is a brand new way of putting your block together. So let's get started. Okay, so for this particular block, you see that we only have 2 colors, the blue and the pink, and then the white background. So the colors that we have here, the teal and the yellow and the white square. The squares are cut to 3.5 inches, and the strips are cut to 3.5 by 6.5. Before we can start putting everything together though, it is very, very important to mark your squares, not the whole block, but you're gonna mark your squares just with a diagonal across the middle. I like to use the friction pens. They are heat sensitive pens, so if I don't like where I've put my mark, it's okay. I can just hit it with the iron and it disappears magically. It's a wonderful tool. There are a lot of people who complain about friction pens, that they are not good to use on quilting because they will do a thing called ghosting, where it just kind of leaves a shadow of the ink when you hit it with the iron. But that doesn't bother me because my quilt is going to be washed. So if I know that my quilt is going to be washed, then I don't mind marking with my friction pen on the fabric. So while I was chit-chatting, I made a mark across from corner to corner on the diagonal on one of these blocks, on one of my white squares. The way we're gonna put this all together, each one of my 6.5 by 3.5 inch rectangles will receive 2 of my squares. When I lay my squares on, I need to make sure that the diagonals are going in the same direction. And I'm going to do this with all of these rectangles, all of my blues, all of my yellows. I can only put one rectangle, or excuse me, one square on at a time, because if you look closely, they overlap. I can't pin something that's going to overlap with another piece of fabric. So I'm just going to move that to the side. And for all of my 3.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles, I'm going to stack my square with the diagonal in the same direction on one end. And then I'm gonna sew. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so I went ahead and laid all of my, well, half of my white squares onto my rectangle, my rectangular fabric, and I'm making sure that all of the diagonals are going in the same direction. Guys, that's super duper important, okay? You don't want to end up making flying geese. We're not doing geese this time. Geese will come later. This time, we just want the diagonal going in the same direction on all of them. I did go through and pin, just put a couple of pins in just to keep it secure. This is a technique called stitch and flip. You're going to be sewing directly onto the line right there. You're not going to sew to the inside or to the outside. You'll sew directly onto the line, technically. Once you stitch on the line, then you're going to cut off the excess on the outside and flip the white out to complete the rectangle that you just cut off. Now, I said technically you're going to be stitching directly on the line. We want to give ourselves a little extra space in our fabric to allow for maybe a little bit of trimming. If you stitch directly on the line, oftentimes we kind of stitch to the inside of the seam, making the piece that will flip out a little too small. We don't want that. So I want you to think about, as you're stitching, to stitch just a little bit on the outside of the seam. And we're talking just a hair width, not much, to the outside of the seam. That's going to give you just a little bit of extra room. It's going to account for the thickness of the fabric, which we know isn't much, but it'll account for the thickness of the fabric and give this inside piece that will now flip out extra space. I know that's a lot to think about. When quilters talk about sewing with a scant 1/4 inch, this is what they're doing. They're not sewing directly on the line, they're sewing just a little bit outside of the line. So I do have my 1/4 inch foot here on my machine, but that's not going to come into play right now because I want to stitch just to the outside of my line on all of them. The other tip that I have for you right here is to use what's called a leader. Using a leader is not always necessary. If you are placing a squared off piece of fabric right into your machine, it is being engaged by both sides or both edges of your feed dogs as it's going through, because it's wide enough. But what we are doing today is starting with a corner. Since both sides of the feed dogs are not going to be engaged, oftentimes what you find is that that corner wants to curl in and get jammed in your machine. The way to avoid that is to use a scrap piece of fabric. It doesn't have to be very big. And we're just gonna fold it so it's double thickness, just like the fabric that we're working with. And we'll sew on the leader first, all the way down, and then insert your next fabric to start sewing. Once we get to the end of our diagonal, just before we hit the end of it, we can insert the next one in like that. This diagonal that you just sewed, this piece, now works as the leader, and it helps to keep the corner from falling in. I'm going to show you what all of those words mean in just a second. Let's take a look. Okay, so what we have here is my leader. I just inserted it. Notice my needle is going to go in about part way in from the edge. Okay, I don't have to start all the way at the beginning. I can start anywhere in the middle when I'm dealing with my leader. I'm going to take a few stitches, and I'm not quite off of my leader. I can pull on it and it's still engaged in the needle. Now I'm going to feed in this corner, and I'm stitching just a hair to the left of my seam. When I get to the end, I then insert my next one and continue on. And notice how it just takes the fabric. It does not suck the tip of my diagonal into the machine. And that, my friends, is what you want. Make sure you stop just before it falls off the fabric. See, I'm tugging on it and it's not falling off. I'm almost fooling the machine to think that there is more fabric coming and the thread doesn't have to get caught. So as you can see, I stitched just on the outside of the line that I drew on each one of them, just to the outside. So I have all 8 of my rectangles sewn with the white square on the diagonal, going all in the same direction. The next step is going to be to literally cut off this part of the square. Now in quilting, we use a 1/4 inch seam allowance for everything. If I needed to sew, I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but at this point I'm just trimming off. I want to keep it about a 1/4 inch, but it doesn't have to be exactly a 1/4 inch. So anything in that zone is going to be okay. Just make sure, guys, that you don't get too close to that seam that you just cut. Notice I'm putting my hand behind my block. So this is what I have now. 1/4 inch, roughly a 1/4 inch seam allowance there. And I'm just gonna do that with all of them. Once I have this done, then I can take it over to my iron and press it. So now I have my pile of lopped off rectangles, and I have a pile of half square triangles. You can, quilters want to know all the time, what do you do with this extra stuff? Use them as leaders. Also, these are large enough pieces that if you wanted to make a postage stamp quilt, you could actually use these scraps for other quilts. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit my squares, my rectangles rather, with an iron. I'm going to set my seam, and then I'm going to iron what is now my triangle out. I want my seam allowance to rest underneath my white fabric. So this is how it's going to look. I'm going to set my seam just like this, then lift up that white and just gently push across with the iron. What that does, such a nice press. What that does is it makes sure that my seam allowance rests underneath my white fabric, and that's where I want it to be. Okay, so let's do that again. Fabric up with the white on top, set the seam, and then just gently push across. What? How lovely is that? And it's nice and crisp. When you use a pressing mat like this, you're able to do all your pressing on your table right beside your machine, right here with your cutting mat. You don't actually have to get up and trek across the room to the ironing board. It makes things a lot more convenient. I also don't have to use any best press. I don't have to use any water or any steam of any sort, because the wool pressing mat gives me a really nice crisp seam with really very little effort. All right, guys, so I have all of my blues and all of my yellows pressed with now a triangle of white on one end. Now I'm going to put the other triangle on the other end. And what I was talking about before, making sure that the squares go in the same direction, the diagonals go in the same direction, is this. I have one diagonal heading, what is that, northeast to southwest. So my other diagonal, my second square with the diagonal, needs to go in the exact same direction, because it's going to fold out to be like that. Okay, if you turn it going in the other direction, you end up with flying geese. And for as exciting as that is to make flying geese, that's not what we're doing today. So make sure that your diagonals are going in the same direction. I'm gonna quickly place my squares on, make sure my diagonal's in the right direction, and pin, and then I'm gonna sew it again. All right, guys, so you didn't watch me actually sew the second diagonal, but I did it anyway. It was magical. So I have all of my second diagonals stitched down at this point, and I'm gonna go ahead and clip and press. Now this time when I press, I'm again going to make sure that my white fabric is on top, and I'm going to press it open this way so that I now have this really cool diagonal happening. And I want the diagonal, I don't want flying geese. And here I am pressing it. Again, set my seams here and push, just lift up my white and push that across gently with my iron. Oh, look at that. It doesn't really matter how wide that seam allowance is underneath, just as long as you have at least 1/4 of an inch, somewhere in that zone. So the finished size of these blocks should be 6.5 inches long by 3.5 inches wide. Once I'm finished pressing all of my seams, I'm going to double check the size with my ruler. It is important, guys, to size up your pieces, your units. It is easy for an oversized, slightly oversized block to sneak in where you expect that your sewing is absolutely perfect. It's easy for that oversized block to sneak in and throw the finished size of the block off because it is not the size it needs to be. Inaccuracies will have a ripple effect down the road. And so we want to make sure we are sizing each one of our units to the correct size before actually putting it into our block and eventually putting it into our quilt, right? Okay, so I have all of them done. Now I'm going to use my ruler and check to make sure that they're the same size. Cross your fingers, because I sure hope they are. My ruler is, I have my 1 inch in the top right-hand corner, and it is 6.5 inches in width. Perfect. So I'm gonna make sure that it's at least 6.5 inches in width and then come down to the 3.5 inch line. Hot dog. Got that one. So I'm just gonna go through and double check all of my blocks, make sure that they fit the criteria. This one is actually a little bit big, so I can trim it. I see that it is a little extended beyond my 6.5 here and a little extended there. I have a little extension there as well. So I'm gonna start with trimming off that little bit. Look at how small that little piece is. Inconsequential, right? And I'll turn it around because I got my right side trimmed and my top edge trimmed, and I have just a little smidge right here that's overhanging. So I'll go ahead and trim that. Ooh, look at that. Nice. These little bitty pieces seem inconsequential, but further on down the line, they'll make a difference. So let's see what this one has to say. So what we have here, this little bitty pile of shavings, this is what I trimmed off of my block. Super important to make sure that those get trimmed off and they are no longer in the way, because they'll throw off the measure of your block as you place elements together to create that block. So those go in the trash. Now, our instructions tell us right here, once we have our blue unit and our pink unit, this will be our pink here, we're going to put them together in pairs just like this with the diagonals running in the same direction. So I've done that with all of them. I'm going to then fold one piece on top, and since they are the same size, I'm not going to have any issue with seams lining up. Cross your fingers. So I'm going to line these up and pin them. When I pin, the parts that are super important are the seams that are there. I want to make sure that my seams lay flat as they're running through the sewing machine. So on this one, I'm putting 4 pins into each pair. One pin follows this diagonal seam that we can see here, and I pinned it to hold down the seam. The second middle one that I have is actually holding this diagonal seam in place. Okay, so I have my 2 diagonals in the middle. I have the first pin is also on a diagonal because it is holding this diagonal seam in place. And then my last one is also diagonal because it is laying on yet another diagonal seam. When you pin, the whole purpose of pinning is to make sure that your fabric doesn't shift. Make sure that it stays in the place where you want it to be. If you don't pin your seams, then the machine, as your fabric is being fed through with the feed dogs, there's a good likelihood that your seam is going to flip on you. And in most blocks, your seams need to be pressed to a particular side. So pin right on the seam, holding that seam allowance down to prevent any flipping of your seams as it runs through the machine. I know it's tedious. No quilter likes to pin, but it is a necessity. I'm gonna go ahead and pin the other ones, and then I'm gonna sew. All right, so guys, I have everything pinned in place for all of my blocks, my pairs. Now, one other thing that I want you to make note of is the fact that I'm sewing on this edge a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have a diagonal coming in this way from my blue side, and I have a diagonal coming in this way from my yellow side. The point at which the two diagonals meet, that needs to touch, and that's where my 1/4 inch seam allowance should be. Don't get too bent out of shape if it doesn't match up, because this pattern is pretty forgiving. Okay, so just make sure, please, that you are dealing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance coming across. You can either eyeball it, you can use your 1/4 inch presser foot here to make sure that you get your 1/4 inch in place, or you can mark it like I have. And all you're gonna do to mark it is just take one of your square rulers. It has a 1/4 inch line on it already. Line up the edge of your block with that 1/4 inch and just draw a quick line across right there where those diagonals meet. Now on your presser foot, your 1/4 inch presser foot, some of you have a 1/4 inch foot that has a blade along the side. It's not actually a cutting blade, but it has a blade on the side as a guide to follow the fabric directly along. However, the blade oftentimes is too large, so instead of using the blade as your guide, use the ski, the outer edge of your ski, your foot, as a guide. So it's not pushed up far there, it is a little bit smaller. And I'm gonna feed these through just like I would regular chain sewing. I don't have to use a leader because I have a nice size piece of fabric feeding through, but I can. If I wanted to, I could. As I approach this seam, it is pinned down. I do want to make sure that it stays down and that it doesn't flop up. Flopping is bad. Yes, I did just sew over pins. So on this one, you see that my stitches go directly on the line that I drew. This one, I was able to get just a little on the outside of the line that I drew, which I do like. That's more of a scant 1/4 of an inch. Again, this one is just on the outside of the line that I drew. And this one also. That, remember, gives me a little bit more room when it comes to opening out my fabric. Gives me a little extra wiggle room. Okay guys, so I have my seams done. My two units together. This one's not the best. I think this one was the rebellious one where I couldn't get my diagonals to meet. Ultimately, that's what I'm looking for these two diagonals to just kind of blend into each other and go continuously. Yeah, this one I stitched directly on the line and it didn't like that. So what I'm gonna do is set my seam. The directions in the pattern don't tell you whether to press to the left or to the right, to this color or to that color. My choice on this particular block, or the unit of this block, is to press the seams open. And here's why. I have two seams coming together in one spot. If I push it to one side, it's going to be bulky with this seam here. It'll be flat here, but bulky here. If I push it to the other side, it'll be bulky here and flat here. But if I split it open, then I can get the bulk of my fabric to kind of disperse and disappear a little bit more. I set my seam and I'm going to use my finger and just open it up a little bit, and using the tip of my iron, I'm not going to use the whole thing, I'm just going to use the tip of my iron to go in and press my seam open. Once I'm all the way to the end, then I can set my iron down and give that seam a good complete press. And there it is. My seam is open and it lays nice and flat. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that with the rest of them. So notice, every time I press it on the back to open up the seam and I have it completely pressed, then I flip it over and give it a good press. Just hit it once on the front. Just because I wanna make sure that that seam is opened up as far as it really wants to go. All right, so here's where the fun part comes in. I have 4 units that look exactly the same. 1, 2, 3, 4. The orientation of the block goes like this. So guys, this is a great pattern. It's a great orientation for your units, but ultimately this is not what we're looking for. We're looking for that white diamond in the middle. So we can do it 2 ways, just like we did this star in 2 ways, with one with the blue as the star and the yellow as the secondary, and then the other one with the yellow as the star, blue as the secondary. We can change it to actually fit the pattern. Oh, that's right. So I want that white square on point in the center. White square forming on point in the center, and shazam. Here we have the actual block that the pattern wanted us to make. And I personally like it this way, but let's play with color again and see how it looks the other way. Honestly, with the fabrics that you choose, and hopefully you'll choose to go with the granny chic, because it's absolutely adorable. With the fabrics that you choose, you'll be able to decide which way you want to go. So we have blue in the center. I'm just going to flip it around so that my yellow is in the center, always making sure that my white square on point is there. And this is what it looks like with the yellow in the center. I don't like it so much, so I'm going to flip it back. Once I have it oriented the way that I want, it's a simple 4-patch block that I'm going to be making. I'm going to flip 1 unit over, the other unit over. I'm gonna pin in such a solid way so that all of my seam allowances stay down as I sew. I'll sew these 2 back to back just like that, and then press them open and then sew the horizontal seam. So let's see that happen. So when you bring your fabric over to your machine, your units to your machine, you want to make sure that you are pinning on the correct side, everything oriented as well as you can, as consistently as you can. I don't know if you guys can see in here. Well, I'll peel it up this way. I have a diagonal. My blue diagonal here needs to match up with my blue diagonal on the bottom piece. Make sure that you get that done as you are pinning. And again, diagonals matching up. This diagonal on the top piece with the blue needs to match up with the gold on the bottom. Now these 2 are really nice because the seam allowances go in opposite directions, so they can nest together very nicely. Nesting just means that your bottom seam allowance goes in one direction, your top seam allowance goes in the other direction, and those stitches can touch right on top. So that one is ready to go. Here we have, this unit is the exact same as this one, it's just flipped on the other side. So I'm looking for the same hallmark, the diagonals to match, the yellow to the blue diagonals to match up and nest together. And of course I'm pinning on both sides of my seams. And I'm going to chain sew them like I normally would. Okay, so I did my chain sewing, got the 2 units together, and I have this one here. If I look carefully, I can see that this diagonal hit right on the point. Wow, that's so good. Pat myself on the back for that one. This one's not bad either. I kind of like this. Okay, so I'm gonna press my seams open one more time, just like we did before, and then I'll do my last seam so that you can see exactly how this block finishes up. Make sure that you orient your blocks the right way. There's that temptation to do something funky and come out with something that's not what you want. Orient it correctly first, then flip it over. I'm gonna make sure that my seams are matching in the middle. It's a good idea to pin from the middle going out. Find some primary seams and pin the primary seams first, and then work outward toward the edge of your quilt. One more seam to stitch, and then we're going to be all done with this block. Okay, so I have everything pinned down and secure for when I stitch it together. Just a little side note, you see me trimming all of those extra threads. It's a good idea as you are sewing to go ahead and trim those extra threads, because when it comes time to actually doing your quilting, those threads are gonna cause issues on the back of your quilt. Here's my finished block. I'm gonna give it a good press real quick. Again, I'm opening up my seams. This is a time when I don't want my seams pressed to one side or the other, just because I have so many of them coming together in one place. And as I press, I want to be aware of what my iron is doing so that my iron is not pushing any of my pieces in the wrong direction, just like this one ended up going in the wrong direction. And guys, that's a wrap. Here is my finished block. I hope that you got some really good tips out of this, not just sewing and getting a scant seam allowance going on, but a little bit of trimming and playing with color. Your blocks are going to be beautiful if you take the time to do all of these little steps. Please subscribe below and come back to see what other tips and tricks you can learn in order to make your blocks as sharp and crisp as the ones that I've been doing. I do have the pattern for this block of the month skill builder quilt available, and the fabric, so if you're interested in those, you can head over to my shop, also linked below, so that you can pick those up and sew along with us. I'll see you next time for block number 4.